Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about things to consider if your jurisdiction has just adopted the UBE. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back. As we're seeing more and more jurisdictions switch to the UBE instead of a state-specific bar exam, many bar exam takers are being put in a kind of strange position of taking a new bar exam, even if they're repeat takers. Or you might find out that all of the bar prep you've done throughout your law school career isn't all that relevant because you're going to be taking a different exam when you graduate than you expected to when you started. So what does this mean for folks taking the UBE for the first time?
Well, I think, the first thing a lot of people have to decide is whether or not having your jurisdiction change the UBE is a good thing because, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Right. And you also can't really do anything about it.
No.
So let's look on the bright side.
Fair point. So I think the first thing to look at is there's the benefit of score portability. This is the whole idea of the UBE.
And this is a huge benefit.
Mm-hmm. I think, we talk to a lot of people who have to move locations and sit for bars, and it can really hamper your ability to get a job. So the idea that you can get a score and move it around the country is pretty powerful. Now, one thing you do have to remember is not all numbers are created equal because each jurisdiction gets to set their own threshold. So let's say you pass an exam like New York that has a score of 266, but then you want to go practice, I think, in Washington, which has a much higher score. If you only got a 267,
right,
you won't be licensed in Washington.
Yeah, so starting at 260, that's where you can squeak in at various jurisdictions around the country. And interestingly enough, even if you do not pass in the jurisdiction you sit in, so say you sit in New York and you get a 261, for example, so you're not going to be passing in New York, but you can actually transfer that score to a jurisdiction with a 260 and waive in.
Yeah. So there are a lot of options for folks. And I think that the good thing about this, especially for individuals who have been struggling with the test, is sometimes people just want to be licensed somewhere.
Right.
Exactly. There are plenty of jobs where you do not need to have an active license in the state that you're residing. And, you can work for the feds, you can do lots of different stuff. So sometimes if you get that 261 and you get that license in that state that you may never move to, that might just be what you need to do the work that you need to do.
Right. You can basically look at those 260 states, see who has the fewest requirements around CLE and other things, and become licensed in that state. And it's totally fine. Even for me, when I was a lawyer, all of my cases were patent cases, and that is constitutionally all federal courts. Mm-hmm. So I just had to be licensed in a state so that I could get licensed in a federal court. And then I could basically, we just hired local counsel. All of our cases were in states we didn't practice in anyway. It didn't matter.
Right. Immigration law, like all of these kind of areas that are all federal law, you just have to be licensed in that state. Most U.S. attorneys and people like that aren't even necessarily barred locally because they move around all the time too. Yeah,
exactly. So it can get a little tricky. You want to make sure you're not practicing unauthorized practice of law, which occasionally does happen in these like in-house counsel type scenarios and things where someone's licensed in one place but not another. Although often with in-house counsel, states do have rules allowing you if you're licensed elsewhere. So point being, don't get too demoralized if you didn't pass in one state. If you are able to go into another state, it might be worth your while to look into it.
Yeah. I think the other benefit to sitting for the UBE is that you get to drop all that state-specific law. Maybe if you'd studied it, then you were really excited about it. But
and that always makes it hard for people. Say, I went to law school in New York, I clerked in Boston, and then I came and eventually set for the California bar. I had never studied the California distinctions to anything. Mm-hmm. So, it's just like kind of all the stuff you have to learn on top of what you already learned.
Yeah. So the beauty is they're just testing the common law.
Yeah. And that means you can just get any sort of commercial outline that is sold, and it will all have the same information in it, and you can just learn that information. There is nothing special you need to know for the UBE. I think it's a little more streamlined.
Yeah, and I also think it probably more closely correlates to what you learned in your law school in your law school classes too, because usually they're teaching the common law in most law schools.
Yeah, they're just teaching kind of a universal version of the law. Very few schools are really trying to give you the law of that state.
Yeah, I think California schools do that, but California's so big and a lot of people stay to practice in California.
Yeah, but if you go to school in most parts of the country, you're reading cases from all around definitely the country, sometimes even the world. I certainly remember reading cases from England and that kind of thing that illustrated a particular point. So this will probably be, just a more generalized, kind of neutral version of the law.
Yeah. So if you find yourself having to take the UBE and this is a new test to you, maybe you've taken a bar exam or two and failed and your state just switched over, what do you do?
Well, I think the first thing you've got to do is figure out what's different. In some states, they've almost been using the UBE for a while. Illinois, for example, they did a few of their own state-specific essays, but they were basically using the MEE, and they were using, I think, APT. So, there, it's not that different. And there may be pros or cons for you in terms of what you're better or worse at. So, I talked to someone the other day who was concerned that he was not great at the performance test, and they were going to put 2 of those on the UBE version. So, that's something, wisely enough, he reached out and is getting help on that.
Right. Yeah, I think you really need to understand what this test is. And I think if you had to see what was different between most jurisdictions, it's these 30-minute MEE questions. I think that these are oftentimes shorter than a lot of jurisdictions who are doing state-specific testing still. So you need to get comfortable with not only answering in 30 minutes, but how streamlined and specific that has to be. That really needs to be learned. I think the performance test, one, is used by a lot of jurisdictions at this point.
They're typically not really writing their own.
I think Pennsylvania still writes their own. California still writes their own. But even those are not that different than the MPT. So I think that for most people, they've had some experience with the MPT. Maybe they didn't get 2 of them, but they do have some experience. And then everybody but our friends in Louisiana are all taking the multiple choice portion, which is pretty universal. So even if your jurisdiction is switching, there's a good chunk of the test that you've probably had some exposure to.
Right. And in some cases, states that did not necessarily have the best reputation for writing really quality exams, I think you'll find the UBE questions make more sense.
Yeah, it's true.
I'm not going to mention who those states might be, but there are some states that did not have a great reputation for really putting together quality essay questions. I think with the UBE, you can at least say, okay, this is a fair test. These have clearly been vetted. People have really thought about these questions. So sometimes people, I think, find them more straightforward. And
it's important to note it's new to you, but not new to the world. So there are plenty of resources and past exams and things that you can access. So, it's also important to remember that when it comes time to prepare, it's not like this is a brand new squeaky clean test that nobody's ever prepared anybody for.
Right, exactly.
All right. We also think it's important to think about what law is going to be different. Because the one thing about the UBE is it does test some stuff that sometimes other jurisdictions don't test, like secured transactions, which is actually very heavily tested.
Yeah, I remember not liking that when I I think Massachusetts tested that, and I was just like, what is this again?
And I think that's one of those, it's kind of like the mortgages on property. They don't really teach that in law school.
No, but it's also one of those that once you sit down with it, really actually is not that difficult. Yeah. You just have to kind of get past the language and figure out the basics on it.
But you do want to sit down and kind of audit what is included to see, where it overlaps and where it doesn't. Because one of the things that you're going to need to do when you start to study again is build on the knowledge that you already know. You're not starting over, even though it's the UBE, and maybe that's different from Illinois or whatever you were studying for before. But you also want to make sure that you share a bit of extra time to dive into some of these subjects that maybe you didn't know, to get up to speed, because some of these are really heavily tested.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way to find out what's heavily tested is to look at a frequency analysis. So conveniently, there are options that will allow you to literally see, okay, this is what the UBE tests heavily. For example, you can get some outlines. I think they even have a free frequency analysis called Smart Bar Prep. And they will show you, 7 out of the last 10 tests have tested this topic, whereas 1 out of the last 10 tests have tested this topic. Very useful. We have a Brainy Bar Bank where we have ranked everything by topic and subtopic and legal topic. So you can drill down and say, okay, the UBE, for example, frequently tests secure transactions. They don't as frequently test whatever else that might be heavily tested on a different exam. So I think just, getting strategic about that and figuring out, okay, these are the areas that I don't really know that I need to know is step one.
Right. And if you want to go in and say, okay, family law, well, that is heavily tested. I didn't have to study for family law on my last exam. I can go into the Brainy Bar Bank and say, okay, what do they test on family law? And then do a lot of questions on these topics. Because the one thing I think is the biggest difference between the UBE and a lot of other tests is the precision in which you have to answer these questions. Because you don't have a lot of time. You can't pad it. You can't do the brain dump.
No, you basically have 30 minutes, and that is to read the question, start to formulate your answer, and write your answer. So you're really probably writing maybe for 20 minutes-ish on a lot of these questions. And that also means you have to know the law with a fair degree of precision. You don't have a lot of room to kind of, fudge and make things up the way that maybe you do in California, where it's a more complicated question. Maybe you remember 80% of the law. You're kind of fudging it on 20%. That doesn't really fly as much on the MEE questions. You just either have to know it or not know it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that people get very frustrated by is the scoring keys that the National Conference of Bar Examiners releases, which are these kind of like treatises on all of these questions.
Right. They're kind of funny.
We've talked about this on the podcast before, but evaluating your work based on these little like mini treatises is something you have to get used to. So one of the things you also have to understand is the materials that you're getting access to, because I think some people read that scoring sheet and kind of they can't breathe because they're like, I'm supposed to do what in 30 minutes?
Wait, they want me to do citations?
Right.
What is this?
I know.
And as we spoke about, this is generalized kind of across the board standard law. They are not expecting you to cite cases on the UBE.
Yeah. So, you got to get used to it. And these little nuances, I think, can be really anxiety inducing if you don't really understand what's going on.
But the reality is, it's just an exam. And you have studied most of this, particularly if you prepared for the bar before. And it's really a question of, getting into that rhythm of writing these 30-minute essays and then moving on. Because there's a lot to do. If you have 3 hours and you have 6 different topics, you've got to be able to switch between those as well.
Right.
So when you're preparing, you want to be thinking about writing 2 or 3 essays back to practice.
Yeah. So you may also find yourself searching for some bar help, whether it be a first time or a repeat taker. I think a lot of repeat takers find themselves in this position where they may have used a commercial bar program, but it was state specific, and now they've got to take a different test, and they're looking at their books and they're wondering, do I just do it again?
Yeah, and interestingly enough, I've learned that not all bar providers will actually give you you failed, you get the free course if your jurisdiction switches on you.
You should call your bar provider.
Doesn't really seem fair, but that is what I was recently told by a student recently. So that's interesting. He's like, I signed up for Illinois and then didn't pass, and now they won't give me the UBE materials.
Interesting. I would call your bar review provider about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You might also find that you want to do some tailored practice to solve some problems, especially if you were a repeat taker. So, you can learn a lot of lessons from what happened, let's say, in Illinois, about what was pulling you down.
You've got to look at these score reports.
Yeah, even if it's not the same test, because you can see, I rocked the UB or the MBE, but I tanked the essays. Well, that's going to be a problem. You better find a bar provider that's going to give you feedback on the writing, but maybe you can use similar tactics to study for the MBE again. There's information to be had here. You're not starting over.
Yeah, so we have a whole podcast episode, in fact, on interpreting your score reports, I believe. But you want to be looking at things like, were your scores consistently low, or were they all over the place? And then that gives you a sense of is it a timing issue? Is it a topic issue? You can find things out from these, and I think it's important to do that. And also, if your jurisdiction has recently shifted, your school may have resources that they're willing to provide to you. So definitely go back and ask them what they're doing for recent grads who are in this position and now have to take a different exam than they expected to.
Yeah. Hopefully the schools have a plan for that.
Hopefully. If not, you ought to talk to your school about that.
Yeah. You have a lot of phone calls, people who are listening who are in this position. But I think when you're making this decision to choose your bar review provider for this new situation, the considerations are still similar. If you're struggling with writing or have special circumstances that, like you have learning differences or you get accommodations and you're finding that the way you've been preparing for the bar hasn't been helping you, you still want to get individualized help like a bar tutor or some courses that will help you do more focused work, because going back and just repeating the same thing you did in a new jurisdiction is probably not going to solve the problems.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people wonder, do they need a new full course? And there, I think it really depends on, what materials you have from your previous attempt or attempts.
Yeah.
And how close those were. So, if you're taking Illinois, like we said, they were basically using the MEE, they were using kind of an MPT, and then they were using the MBE. Like, you can probably study off of those plus a shorter outline, like something along the lean sheet, smart bar prep type of world. But if it's a state where, it was a totally different exam and it was all pretty much state specific, and suddenly you need to switch to the UBE world, then you may need more extensive materials.
I think you need to evaluate what you would get from that repurchasing that large commercial bar program. So make a list of like what you need. So is one of the things that you need access to ME and MPT questions. Well, there are much.
You can get cheap,
right?
you don't
sell it.
You don't need to buy a course.
You don't need to buy thousands of dollars of courses. Like we sell that.
We can sell you that for like under $300.
Right, exactly. So that is easy. Do you just need some outlines on the UBE? Again, Smart Bar Prep. Go on there, purchase the outlines.
Frequency analysis. They've done them. Like
right.
It's good. It's solid. It's all the information you need.
Right.
Just learn it.
Right. And so like, again, let's say you want new MBE work, you can purchase Adaptabar for, again, like under $300.
I think they're over that, but basically.
Okay, a little over $300.
a fairly nominal
fee. So at this point, even with like a bunch of different resources,
you're still under $1,000.
You're under $1,000, which is going to be cheaper than pretty much almost all of the big bar review programs. So, you can use these kind of piecemeal opportunities to create a cheaper option for you, or allow you to spend less money on getting these materials and maybe some money on getting feedback.
Right, exactly.
Which I think that if you have been struggling, if you've already failed, you may still want somebody to be able to guide you through this process.
Yeah, I think you just want to be smart about it. I don't think just signing up for the same, variety of the course that you already took elsewhere and failed a couple of times isn't going to necessarily help you pass the UBE.
Yeah. And again, because you have to be so precise in your writing, if you've struggled with writing in the past, there's just no wiggle room. You got to clean up your writing. You got to typically get feedback to do that.
Yeah. And I think too, you've got to do focused practice, particularly in these 30-minute essays, because they're so quick that, you just have to be in that rhythm. And I think a lot of people struggle with timing issues because it's easy just to go 5 minutes over on the first one and then 5 minutes over on the second one. And suddenly you've got a huge deficit.
Yeah.
You've got real problems. You're not going to finish. And you just can't do that.
No, I know. I was just talking to one of our tutors about a few students that are really struggling with the time management piece. And it's not just, doing the work in the time, but it's like this act of stopping yourself. Right. We hear this over and over again. I just can't stop.
It's like, really?
It's like move your hands away from the computer. But I think for a lot of people, it is really challenging to force themselves to stop and accept that they cannot finish. And so, with this time crunch of the 30-minute questions, which are so fast, you really need to appreciate what you can write in that time period. Now, I will say that although these NCBE score sheets can be really overwhelming, the ones that are basically the treatises we were just talking about, some jurisdictions do publish student answers for some of the most recent tests. So you can also spend a little time on Google and find some of these real answers to get a better idea of what students are actually doing. And that might also be a check for you to be able to say, okay, like this is what I need to be able to do in 30 minutes, or this is a great answer in 30 minutes. Maybe I can write a sort of great answer.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is about process. So, sometimes people, when they see 30 minutes, they think, well, I don't have time to make any type of outline. I just have to start writing. That is a terrible idea.
Bad idea.
Very bad idea. Those 3 to 5 minutes that you spend getting some type of outline on paper, which literally is basically, okay, you've read the question, you've identified the basic legal issues, hopefully you know the law element by element, so you write down those elements, you maybe pair some facts with them, and then you have your outline, and then when you go through it, all you have to do is basically pull those pieces, those elements in as headers, do that discussion of the facts that apply to that, draw a conclusion, move on to the next one, and you just keep going.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if you know this is coming down the pipeline and you are still scratching your head because you don't know what to expect, if you like listening to this podcast, you can go back through our archives and I walk through a number of MEE questions. So you can get an idea.
So exciting, Lee.
I know Allison has listened to all of them. While you're making bread. That's what you do when you make bread.
But
you listen to me talking about
I mean, I think it is useful to hear people think through these. Like we have our Writing of the Week program that people have found helpful in raising their scores because it's a similar thing. It's really just breaks down this is the law that you need to know to answer this question. Mm-hmm. Now you answer the question, do your best, and then we come back together and we talk about it.
Yep.
On a video. It walks you through, you should have talked about this. This is why this fact mattered. So I think that level of structure, particularly if, you maybe didn't get that so much in law school, can help people understand that, it's pretty formulaic.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
And I think it's just a lot of it comes down to just really learning the law in a focused way, which is where something like those shorter outlines can really help because they don't have that much material on them.
Yeah, you just can't talk about everything in the kitchen sink. There's no time.
No, there's really not. I mean, you can write a con law textbook or you can write a con law essay in 30 minutes.
Yeah, and one of them will lead you to passing the bar. One of them will not.
Yeah, and the good thing is, these have to be more focused topics. So it's not like in California where maybe they mix up 3 different topics and you might be talking about community property and wills and trust and family law or something just totally insane.
Right.
I mean, here it's really more like, okay, this is a conspiracy question. Mm-hmm. There are 3 people. I need to talk about each one in turn. I need to go through that analysis. You don't have time to be rewriting rules and things like that, so don't do that. You just got to think about the best way to structure your essay.
Yeah. And the other thing you have to be really aware of is we had some folks in our group, the tutors oftentimes talk about concerns that students have raised. And I think there are some people who think it's a great idea to game the MEE and to only, focus on 5 questions and then just maybe kind of not do the last question. And that isn't a great approach in our opinion, but you have to try it to see that.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to typically be a very, high probability pass event. I mean, of course, you can bomb one essay and still pass. I'm just not sure you should make that your overall strategy because you're really relying on those other 5 essays to be absolutely top notch. And you don't know what topics you're going to get. Maybe only 4 of the topics are things you're really, really comfortable with. So, I think you've got a better shot at raising your score from, like a 1 to a 3 by doing something than you do by just expecting to get 5s across the board.
Yeah, I agree. So I know we talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast, but before we finish up, I wanted to go back to this idea of are you forum shopping?
Right, because you can forum shop.
Because you can forum shop.
And there's certain times that does make sense.
Yeah. I think, again, we talked about if you are really worried that you just need a license and it doesn't matter where it is, you may want to go to the easiest jurisdiction you can find. Typically, I would say the easiest is the lowest cutoff score and a high pass rate. So that's your goal. So you can find out that information. You can find out pretty much all of that information on the NCBE website.
Yeah, they even have a map that shows you the passing scores that are required in each jurisdiction.
Yep. So you can, gather a lot of information. If you're going to choose to do that, I would make sure you call those bars. I think a lot of times people forget that you can still pick up the phone and talk to a human.
Oh yeah, you can get actual information from them.
Yeah, we call. Yeah, don't tell the California bar. We call them with questions a lot.
Yeah, and they answer.
It's really helpful.
The other week we were trying to figure out if they were going to be mailing the score or the essays, and one of our tutors just called them and then updated everyone that actually they'll be available online tomorrow at 6 p.m.
Yeah, so good job, California bar, saving trees. I appreciate that.
Yes,
and mail, carbon footprint, but. Really, you're just there's a person who has answers on the other end.
And they know the answer to this question.
So you can call these bars and say, I reside outside of the state. I want to consider getting a license here. What are the requirements? Because you also want to make sure that your MPRE meets the requirement.
Right. So and they have different character and fitness that may be more or less of a pain.
Sometimes you might need a referral from an attorney in that state. Do you know an attorney in the state?
I had to get that in Massachusetts. It was a real pain.
Yeah. So do your homework, do your research, but I think there are a lot more options than there used to be. The other reason why I think you might want to consider forum shopping is for rules around accommodations.
Yeah, there's a lot. Mm-hmm. Some states are definitely notoriously less accommodating, shall we say. And some of those states are close to other states that are not so unaccommodating. So, if you have had issues asking for accommodations and not getting them in a certain jurisdiction, you might strongly consider going to a different one, because once you pass, it doesn't matter.
Right. And it's not just getting the accommodations. Some jurisdictions are notorious for not really having a great appeals process, which I've got to say, I don't know how that jives with the ADA. But
yeah. Well, the lawyers make the rules, I guess.
I know. So, but you also, want to understand, if they say no, do you have an opportunity to appeal? Do you have an opportunity to present more evidence? Because that also might make a big difference in whether or not you get the extended time or other accommodations that you're looking for.
Right, and just the timeline on getting accommodations. What are the deadlines to apply?
Mm-hmm.
How soon are they going to tell you? Are you going to be dangling out there a week or two before the exam, not knowing if you're going to get accommodations? I mean, generally, this is something we always recommend you sort out as early as possible.
Yep.
But, if you have waited till the last minute, there may be states that are more generous in letting you apply at the last minute.
Absolutely. All right. Any final thoughts?
Well, one thing I just want to address, what about people who are still in school and they know that their states are going to be switching? So, for example, surprisingly enough, Texas is switching to the UBE soon.
We were just at a conference talking to Texas law professors about this.
Yeah. So, that's always that. I thought they would be one of the last holdouts. And that's, it's an interesting exam. It's 3 days. It tests things like oil and gas law that, people have been taking classes in. I think in some cases, if you're still in school, this might impact the courses that you take.
Mm-hmm. I agree. If you don't know what's tested on the UBE, I would go look it up.
Yeah, instead of taking that oil and gas class, maybe you want to take family law, or you want to take, secured transactions.
Maybe an advanced civil procedure class. Civil procedure is almost always tested on the UBE
as well. It is,
I
think, the most heavily tested subject, which is fascinating because it's not that heavily tested in California.
No.
We found this out when we made the Brady Bar Bank. We're like, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
These do not align at all. In fact, I think we have some blog posts on exactly what topics and subtopics are commonly tested on the UBE versus California. But I think if you're still in school, you want to be thinking about, again, what resources is your school going to be providing to you? Are they going to be giving you, or is there a bar class where you're going to be doing MEE essays? I guess that's redundant. For practice, what are they doing? Presumably they have a big program to support you in the current exam, but what are they doing to help you shift to this new exam? Do they have people on staff who know things about this? I would be asking these questions.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And you should ask your bar reps that are coming and hanging out in your hallway before you sign up with a bar review program about what their plan is to change.
Right. Or if you've already signed up with one, what are they going to be doing?
Yeah.
So none of these are questions that can't be answered. I think it's just something you want to think about.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time, but I want to take a second to remind everyone to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. We have lots of information on what the UBE is and how to study for it.
And podcast episodes.
Oh, and podcast episodes. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. We got a few nice reviews this week and it really brightened my day.
It really did. Someone said something very nice about the 200th episode. So thank you for
listening. Yeah, thank you for sending us nice notes. It does really, we read them and it just it makes our day. It does warm our heart. If you have any questions or comments or even suggestions for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.